One of the enduring challenges America will face as a civilization 2025 and onward is the problem of mobocracy. Now, our country is not necessarily alien or unfamiliar with this problem, as I will demonstrate very shortly, but I believe we are entering a mobocratic age where roving mobs, whether they be digital mobs, whether they be physical mobs, whether those mobs be propped up by institutions, or whether those mobs be guided by their own sense of self-righteousness and ideological capture, will be trying to assert and change the political landscape and change the social landscape through force of numbers and through intimidation and through coercion. And I think a lot of people are going to be sucked in by this, are going to be scared by this, just as they have been in the past. So in this video, I'm going to identify the characteristics of mobocracy. I'm going to explain why I believe we are heading into a mobocratic age, and I'm going to provide some simple suggestions on how we could possibly navigate this and emerge much stronger as Americans and also as thinking people. But before we get into that, my friends, hope all of you are doing well. I'm Christian Watts. Thank you so much for being here. If you enjoy political commentary with a philosophical bent, then I must implore you, please like, share, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can, my friends, to ensure our channel, our message, and our overall goal, which is to preserve our country and also to educate people on the nuances of this world, is successful. You can be sure to like, share, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can, my friends. I appreciate it. We are in a new year, and so it's time not necessarily for new kinds of thinking, but new kinds of engaging with the world that will leave us all better off and that will help us escape the dungeon of mediocrity that so much modern discourse tends to shove us in whenever we partake in it. So again, if this seems like a good idea for you guys, then please again, be sure to support the mission. Now please enjoy the video. So, the reason I think mobocracy is a particularly virulent threat in this new year is because I saw the events that occurred immediately after the election of President Trump. Now, regardless of what you feel about President Trump, that's actually secondary. President Trump himself, as a political figure, over the course of his career, has caused a lot of different political forces to emerge from the shadows and show their true colors, even forces that people believed were right-leaning or conservative. And so this mere act of transparency, by osmosis I call it, caused a lot of different people to reevaluate their views on the political spectrum and also on the political establishment, which has ushered in this new age of sort of dissident populism. So regardless of what you think, this is the age, this is the phenomenon that we're undergoing. A lot of people tend to believe that populism is somehow a bad word or an evil word. I say that populism is neutral until you look at the context, and the context of the populist movement will indeed show if it is good or bad. It'll show its nature. A populist movement that is based in the original principles of the founding generation, that is based on restoring this classically Republican skepticism towards authority, that is based on correcting the abuses of authority and also correcting the excesses of power with the mass veto, which is simply an exercise of the consent of the governed. That kind of populism is actually quite great. Populism in other contexts may not be good, or it may be good, depending on, again, what the conditions of that particular place are. I just wanted to make that note. But there were several reactions that alarmed me, more than they normally would have, and immediately got me to think the implications of them should they be followed through. For example, there was a group called the Working Families Party that immediately after the results of the election organized this teleconference call where over 40,000 plus people on YouTube alone were watching it. Now, this call wasn't just broadcast on YouTube. It was also broadcast on other social media platforms. So the 40,000 there, plus the innumerable amount of other people that were watching other platforms, plus the people that were watching it in the replays of it, I have no idea. I can't even calculate how many folks were actively being influenced by this information, but we can indeed assume that it was a very large amount. And on this call, they were discussing the idea of a mass resistance, of taking direct action to resist the Trump era. The title of the call was called Post-Election Mass Call, Making Meaning of the Moment. And the description said, Donald Trump will be returning to the White House. It's up to us to build the movement that will fight for each other. This is not the only call that this particular group had. And this call featured both politicians, it featured activists, and the The entire goal of this call was to get people to organize small groups in their own communities that would be focal points for what this group calls resistance. Now, this wasn't covered by pretty much anyone. And I'll play a few clips from the call here just so you can see the kind of tenor and tone of it.
There are literally tens of thousands of you tuning into this live stream, and this call is being sponsored by hundreds of organizations around the country. If Donald Trump and his MAGA loyalists wanted us to come into this next phase of the struggle disoriented and without a plan, the sheer numbers of people here and the mobilizing power it represents says something different.
And we must, in this moment, not back down from waging militant, disruptive organizing campaigns.
This went under the radar. These are far-left activists mobilizing, not just with grassroots power, but also with institutional power to try to impact the next 4 years or even longer in this country. Now, let me just make something very clear. There's nothing wrong with protesting authority. There's nothing wrong with voicing your approval or disapproval with whoever is in power at a particular time. These are quintessentially American values, and these are values that you must have if you want to live in a moral society. Having said that, when we look at the premises of leftism, and we look at how leftists typically see direct action. We can look through history, whether it be through Lenin or Stalin, the idea of the propaganda of the deed, which basically encourages violence for the sake of changing things, whether it be vandalism, the idea that property is merely a nuisance in the face of broader goals, and it is rather secondary to human well-being, and it sometimes, in their view, actually erodes human well-being, which is why property rights are so oftentimes attacked as merely being product of this sort of materialistic society, as opposed to being the fulfillment of man's self-ownership and the basis upon which he has legitimacy through which to act in the society. That's what property rights actually are. They are your enabling principle of legitimacy for you to interact with the society. Because if you own a nothing, you have no grounds to stand on in moving about in society. And that's a different topic for a different day, but this is the fundamental viewpoint here. So if you look at leftist premises, we see they have a very coy relationship with violence or with coercion or with threats. Look at the praise of Luigi Mangione, for example. There were a lot of folks who said that he didn't harm an individual necessarily. What he did was actually he harmed a system. So this sort of, as I mentioned in my previous video, structural view of man, which demotes the human meaning beneath a broader concept and then makes human life negligible and discards it if it means attacking the broader concept. This is the kind of way the activist grassroots left thinks. And these are the kinds of principles which enable mobocracy. And I think that call, where they are organizing groups, apparently in the course of the call, the organizers said that over the course of the call, there were hundreds of people that signed up to create small community organizations relating to the goals of this call in their own towns and cities. This is, my friends, quite concerning given the environment we live in and also given the context of how leftists tend to handle these particular activities with their idea of direct action. My thesis is mobocracy will be a great threat to America than almost anything else in recent history, especially during the second Trump era. And this needs an equal and opposite response from constitutionalists and from those who tend to be a part of the MAG coalition. Now, I must say, mobocracy is not new in America. In fact, I think the best way to understand the concept is by understanding it through evaluating the history of ideas. So, in America, mobocracy has flared up in certain parts of the country, but also then flared down. But even over the past few years, we've seen instances of it. So more recently, for example, during the George Floyd protests, that was a clear example of mobocracy. If we define mobocracy as simply, some people would say mob rule, or I would simply say the actions of a mass group of people acting in a violent way or a coercive way or an antisocial way, i.e. in a way that harms civil society by violating justice, controlling the governing mechanisms of a country or effecting law and policy. That's mobocracy. And we'll get into that more in a second as well. If we define it as that, then clearly the George Floyd protests were emblematic of mobocracy. The fact that Minneapolis and several other cities across the nation suspended their protection of individual life and property rights to give way to a sort of social justice furor that ended up burning down entire sections of cities, that ended up destroying businesses, destroying economies, and wrecking lives, all in the name of pursuing this grandiose idea of justice relating to a case that I think did not warrant that level of, or never can warrant that level of behavior. That was a clear instance of mobocracy. We've seen across, for example, the world, we've seen different protests, especially mass resistance protests from Muslims who believe that certain host countries that they've come from or come into by ways of immigration are not treating them right. And so we've seen mass resistance protests where there's oftentimes violence. We've seen, for example, in the UK, we've even seen more subtle influences of mobocracy. We've seen in the UK entire communities and streets being governed by Sharia law, and police officers not even willing to operate in those streets because they personally believe if they do so, they could be causing an offense or might cause trouble. For a very long time, the idea of grooming gangs was considered to be weird and considered to be a right-wing talking point, but it's actually, unfortunately, a reality throughout northern France and throughout England. Chaz and Chop in Seattle, the seizure of an entire community for the sake of a sort of terroristic goal from Antifa, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, that's also another instance of recent mobocracy. So mobocracy is not necessarily new. We can see it. We see it bled into the actions of certain groups in the country. We must also very briefly discuss the problem of digital mobocracy. So if a mobocratic action or a mobocratic rule is something that happens on a mass scale from a group that is trying to govern something or is trying to assert control over something through sheer force of will and intimidation and so on and so forth, then a digital mobocracy is that same phenomenon just played out in an environment that is governed by zeros and ones as opposed to an environment that's governed by the laws of material reality. And so we see this actually happen all the time. Cancel culture, going after celebrities or people that have done things or said things that were deemed to be unacceptable to the modern orthodoxy, is actually a good example of digital mobocracy because it was entirely driven by numbers, entirely driven by public pressure, and that public pressure was viewed by certain people as a means of legitimizing the requests of these mobs. And so we've seen in other cases as well, mobs being used to change, for example, how governance should happen in the worst way. So the problem with digital mobocracy is that it encourages a kind of hive mind mentality, hive mind approach to important issues that triggers a bandwagon effect that does not actually, in my opinion, cause a lot of people to consider what they're advocating for. They simply want to get into the sort of new popular fad, whether it be condemning somebody or supporting something. Digital mobocracy is more of a nascent threat because, again, we are still just entering the digital world. We're still dealing with implications, but it's already shown itself to be a fearsome force. And given the ease of access, the fact that you only need a phone or a computer to get into a digital mob as opposed to going out and protesting in the street or doing something like that, which requires much more physical exertion, we may actually see mobocracy become entirely a digital phenomenon as time marches forth and we get more interconnected through the digital world. And that's danger because the norms of the digital world are divorced from the norms of society that I was mentioning a moment ago. And that can then also trigger perhaps a lot of different variants of mobocracy that are more ugly than even the worst kinds that we've seen in real life. But we go even back further than this to other centuries. Lincoln himself, during his day, when he was a legislator in Illinois, he had made the famous Lyceum address. And in this address, he explicitly addressed mobocracy by name and called out and condemned the mobocratic spirit. He was particularly referring to the lynch mobs that were in his town, in his area, across the country as well, who were attempting to attack people who were against slavery and attempting to kill anyone that they thought were inimical to their goals. So even if you weren't a partisan about the slavery issue back then, because that was obviously a very big issue, there were abolitionists and non-abolitionists back then, even if you weren't a partisan back then, if you were even associated with a faction that these lynch mobs didn't think you should be associated with, they would harm you, they would kill you. And Lincoln mentioned all this in his address. And his basic argument is this: when you act outside of the institutions of a society to pursue change, you harm the society, and you also harm any chance of there being a social peace. Now, in some sense, he is correct. When you act outside of the norms that institutions and society tend to perpetuate, norms that foster human collaboration, then most certainly you have a very strong chance of harming the social peace, providing those norms are actually conducive to the social peace. If you look at different things throughout history, different norms throughout history, some of them aren't. If you have a norm in your community where you burn witches, or a norm in your community where you like to arrest people for saying curse words, maybe you're not conducive to social peace. Maybe you're actually conducive to antagonism and a deep sense of hatred amongst people in a community. But if you have a norm that says violence is not acceptable for political ends, unless it is in defense of one's livelihood or one's property, then in that particular case, that norm is conducive to social peace. But Lincoln's solution to all of this is the true problem. Lincoln said that the best way to stop the Mobocratic spirit from seizing the country was to be reverent towards the law, even laws that are bad laws. So in other words, for Lincoln, his emphasis was on holding law over ethics. And he believed that mobocracy, being the absence of law, must be answered by a reverence of law, as opposed to believing what is correct, that is, mobocracy, being the violation of ethical law, must then be addressed by trying to reconstitute and reassert ethical law, and then ensuring the positive law, the law that governments pass, follows it. So in his instance, his answer to mobocracy is rather weak and it's rather unfortunate. But then you have what happened to Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith, of course, the founder of Mormonism. There were a lot of people in the 1840s that were trying to hurt him as well. In fact, an excerpt from a book by Spencer W. McBride that covers this says the following, that in 1843, there were difficulties that ultimately led for Joseph Smith's decision to run president, and these difficulties included another attempt by Missouri to extradite Smith, this time through a failed kidnapping attempt in Illinois. In addition, the Mormons practice of block voting alienated them from the Illinois Whigs and some of the state's Democrats. Many of these anti-Mormon partisans resolved to drive Smith and his followers from the state. Smith and other Mormon leaders sought to shore up their legal and civic protections and passed several extreme city ordinances to this purpose, ordinances that only fueled the outcry further against them. So the Mormons, when they were dealing with their problem, tried to fix this problem of mobocracy by way of passing laws to fix it, but the laws only emboldened the broader anger beneath the mobocratic furor. Here's the point. Mobocracy doesn't have to always come in the form of lynch mobs, or the form of violence, or the form of taking over communities, or in the form of intimidation. Mobocracy can actually be assisted by the institutions in a society. It's one thing Lincoln didn't understand either. Institutions have the ability to whip up a certain kind of either furor or a certain kind of sentiment within the hearts and minds of people in the society that makes them want to mobilize in a mob-like manner to address certain issues. This is precisely what universities in this country have been doing for decades by indoctrinating kids into believing certain paradigms or other paradigms. Because, for example, when you look at a lot of these, for example, a lot of mass protests on social justice issues, a lot of the kids, a lot of the young people that actually get involved in that kind of stuff don't have an intimate understanding of the issue. They have a certain belief or feeling that comes from the culture around them and also comes from the institutions in that culture that are instilled upon them. When the entire idea of the entire ethos of modern education to make students into activists follows this kind of method as well. Because if a student is an activist as opposed to being a scholar or a thinker, and people may say, I'm an activist scholar. Well, that's actually an oxymoron too. Because your ethos as a scholar is to study the issues and disseminate information fruitfully. If you're an activist scholar, then that must mean that you have two ethos that are conflicting. The ethos of studying and disseminating correctly, and the ethos of advocating for a particular worldview. That's not to say that scholars can't have their own worldview. They certainly can. But the worldview should be subordinate to their course of their study. So making students activists as opposed to thinkers makes them subordinate rather to a certain ideology that moves their action, which may belie the demands of truth and the demands of actual knowledge that are independent of activism. So it can be aided and abetted by institutions. And on that call I showed you with Trump, there are several politicians on that call that are trying to organize these mass community groups for resistance. That's another instance of institutions aiding and abetting a kind of furor sentiment that spawns mob-like behavior. But it can also be anarchic. It can also simply just be, as I mentioned, a group guided by their own beliefs or their own ideas. Antifa has a lot of this, by the way, that moves on the basis of those ideas and has no regard for the broader society around them. They're not controlled by any higher force. They're acting independent of institutions, but institutions may still enable these groups by refusing to hold them accountable. For example, the Southern Poverty Law Center, one of the most defamatory organizations in the entire country, they have a habit of ignoring violence from left-wing groups like Antifa and refusing to put them on their hate map, which covers, funnily enough, almost exclusively accounts of right-wing violence, and instead they will advocate for the same things that Antifa advocates for, like, for example, whether it be having certain books in schools, whether it be certain kinds of extreme political programs. They'll advocate for that, but they'll do it in an institutional way, in a way that's more friendly to the norms of society, whereas the Antifa is a more radical expression and rejection of those same norms. So you have institutional mobocracy, which foments the mob-like behavior, and then anarchic mobocracy, which is sort of the raw form of that kind of behavior. And both of them can either work together or work separately, but both of them ultimately have the same end. Both of them, number one, defy the social peace. Both of them make it try to govern politics by means of mob passion as opposed to reason. And both of them are ultimately, I think, a threat to reasoned debate, and ultimately also a threat to norms that ensure a good society. So how do we deal with this problem? We deal with it, number one, by doing our best to make it a point to address the core of mobocracy. The core of mobocracy, as I mentioned a moment ago, is passion. It is passion. Mobs can more easily form around things they're mad about. Which is why, for example, if you see some great injustice happens, if, for example, someone gets killed by the police, a lot of folks will form a mob and they'll get mad and they'll riot and they'll burn things down, even without knowing the facts of the case. It's a form of democracy. Well, passion is at the core of that. Now, could someone organize a mob through their reason? Of course they could. And in fact, those are the most dangerous kinds of mobs. But most of the time, mobs, especially pop-up mobs, they form because people are mad, angry, sad, dejected, something like that. We must do our best to build a culture where that kind of behavior, where thinking with your heart for your head is not seen as a benevolent act, but is instead seen as something that is not encouraged. It should not be encouraged whatsoever. I think that's the first thing. Number two, institutions have to be better barriers against their own role in whipping up mobs. So, for example, politicians, public figures, people who hold some kind of esteem in the public mind should not be encouraging these kinds of things to happen. And us, the people, should be calling them out and criticizing them when they do encourage, kinds of mass modes of mob violence or kind of mass modes of mass resistance. That should be called out. And the norms, again, of the society should be reasserted over them. That's not to say this should be done with law, but this should be done instead with our voices. One of the reasons why Mobocracy succeeds is because the voices of the real people, not the voices of the people that want to do violence and want to cause havoc, but the voices of the real people who actually want to maintain a civilization, oftentimes go unheard because they're not asserted loud enough. The third way to handle Mobocracy is by having zero tolerance for acts of violent mobocratic governance. The only reason Chaz or Chop were able to actually succeed is because laws were not enforced. The police chief of Seattle was unwilling to actually go in and do anything until the very last minute. The reason why the George Floyd protests happened in the way they happened, with burning down cities, is because laws were not enforced. The mayor of Minneapolis was actually captured by the same ideologies of the activists, and he was utterly scared of them, and he didn't want to seem as if he was siding with the right or whatever. The way to do this is, again, by enforcing the laws, and in doing so, insert a kind of intellectual virtue. It's the mark of a man, a strong man, a wise man, to be able to entertain his own ideas without letting them govern him to the point that his basic decency is defiled. If you find yourself being governed by your own ideas to the point that your basic decency and your basic sense of humanity is defiled and you're able to justify certain things that shouldn't be justified in a civilized society, then you should probably reevaluate how you're interacting with your worldview. And you should probably, in my opinion, also reevaluate your worldview as well. I think this mobocratic age that we're about to enter, which I suspect we're going to enter, can be navigated well, but we have to navigate it with eyes wide open and also navigate it with a strong sense of determination to ensure that our disputes are not handled in a mob-like fashion, but they are instead handled in a civilized manner. And we can start by looking at ourselves and how we discuss these issues, and then try to project out a much calmer and smarter way of doing so to the rest of the country. My friends, like, share, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can to ensure that we get our message out successful. Be sure to, again, follow me. If you want to donate, you can do that as well. I love you guys so much, and please stay pensive.